wonderful book, The Last Colony, which tells the true story of the struggle of the Chagosians and the last colony and the carving out of the Chagos and the idea of the British that they could refuse to give the Chagos Archipelago back to the deported population. And the story of your own struggle that lasted, I think, over 10 years to finally get the latest judgment from the court in The Hague. Philippe Sands, we've seen you here at Bibliotopia before. Great pleasure. You weren't talking about Mauritius then, but about a subject that was closer to your own life, East-West Street, a book you published several years ago, a personal and historical investigation that took you to Lemberg, or Lviv, the Polish city that was the birthplace of your family, where there was a large Jewish community that was decimated by the Shoah. And you tell about not only the fate of your own family, and this is where I think there's a link with The Last Colony, a place where it's possible to judge what happened. And in that book you talked about the Nuremberg trials. Philippe Sands, perhaps my first question should be about the topic of Bibliotopia this year. The theme is uncertainty. As I read your book, two things struck me. On one hand, we have the unwavering certainty of the Chagosians, and especially Lisby Élysée, the certainty of the rightfulness of their right to return to the island, which never wavered from 1973 to 2018. And on the other hand, the uncertainty of the epoch. You have retraced the history of this period. We've seen how public opinion, laws oscillate in one direction or another. Is that how you see things? Yes. But let me begin by thanking the Michalski Foundation for inviting us to come and make our presentation, and for asking Marie-Philomène and Guillaume to join me. Let me give you a very good piece of news. On the 3rd of November 2022, the British government announced a change in their position. The government of the United Kingdom decided that they were going to start negotiations with Mauritius to, as they said, respect the rule of law, uphold the rule of law, and envisage the return of the Chagosians, including Lisby Élysée, and the reattachment or the recognition of the fact that the Chagos Island belong to Mauritius. I hope that we're coming to the end of the period of uncertainty, but you never know. The negotiations have only been going on for a few months, and we will see what happens, but things are moving forward, and I'm nearly optimistic. I would like to say that this change of position is related in some way to the publication of my book in the UK and in France in September. But I would like to say that, but I don't think it's true. But can't affirm this as a fact, but I think that what changed was Ukraine. What does Ukraine have to do with this matter? Lviv, the city I know so well, what does it have to do with Chagos? The British very much want the Russians out of Ukraine. They want to put an end to the illegal occupation by Russia. They're going to Africa, South America, Asia, and they say, help us to expel the Russians who are illegally occupying a large part of Ukraine. And the presidents and the ministers of foreign affairs say, you're occupying a portion of Africa illegally, and you think you have the right to come and tell us to help you, ask us to help you? No way. Hypocrisy, double standard, and I think that that is where the answer to your question lies. It's clear that power balances in the world are changing. We don't know exactly where this is going to lead, but I think we are really living in a time of great uncertainty. But this is what you say throughout the book. It's the butterfly effect, how the war in Ukraine can lead countries to change their position, and even at the UN against Great Britain, how Brexit ruined the image of Great Britain. When Putin says, look what's happening in the Chagos, this is why he wanted to come back to the history of colonization and cover it right back to the Atlantic Charter. We all know this. We know that in our families, with our friends, everything we do can have unexpected, unforeseen consequences, and we don't know what they might be. When Mr. David Miliband announced in 2009 or 2010 the establishment of an MPA around the Chagos Archipelago, I don't think he could ever have imagined that the effect of this announcement would have such catastrophic effects on the public relations of the UK, that it would that the Prime Minister of Mauritius would be so furious that he would go out and look for lawyers to try to bring a case in The Hague. So this unforeseen effect is still, however, to be placed in the context of a long continuity of legal matters. Chagosians never stopped fighting, not for 1 second in these 50 years. And I need to emphasize this. I think I say it in the book. It's not us. It's not the barristers who won this case. It's the Chagosians. Why? There are two reasons. Firstly, as I stated in the play and also in the book, they struggled for 2 decades in the UK courts to no avail. But they got some documents through secret documents thanks to the discovery process in the UK. And it was thanks to these documents that the Chagosians obtained through these court cases, which they lost, that the International Court of Justice was able to conclude that the population of Mauritius did not voluntarily consent to the carving out of the archipelago, that it was forced on them under duress. And the second aspect, clear in the play and also the book, the key moment in the case was Lisby Elizy's statement, 3 minutes, 47 seconds, her statement before the court. It was absolutely overwhelmingly moving, and we knew that we had a chance then. It was like being in a theater or an opera. There are some very rare moments where there's absolute silence in the room, and there's a bond that is created between those on the stage and between the audience. And that is what happened at The Hague, at the International Court of Justice. This Chagosians' certainty, an unfailing struggle over 50 years that led us here, I think. Yes, but your struggle and your intervention were certainly valuable. You represented Mauritius, although you're a British citizen. You decided to embrace the Chagosian struggle. You had no particular ties with Mauritius, as far as I know. Why would you embrace a struggle that you have no relationship with? I had no contact with Mauritius. When the Prime Minister called me, I was skiing in Avoriaz, as one does, and I saw my phone light up, and 232, what country code is that? I didn't really want to answer, but it was the Prime Minister. I didn't even know where the Chagos Islands were. And all of this led to me being not only British and French, but also a citizen of Mauritius. Why? It's because of COVID. As we mentioned tonight and in the book, there was a case at the court in Hamburg, and there was this was during the pandemic, and the German rules were very strict. You couldn't get into the country without a 2-week quarantine. There was no way I was going to quarantine for 2 weeks for 3 days of pleadings. So they found a rule that said, oh, diplomats can enter the country without being quarantined. Would you agree to have a diplomatic passport from Mauritius? And I said, why not? So they found in the laws and statutes in Mauritius that in order to have a diplomatic passport, you had to be a citizen of Mauritius. So they offered me citizenship. So I'm now the proud holder of a Mauritius passport and nationality. I thought that I'd give it up afterwards, but I haven't done it. This all happened when I was turning 60, and a few weeks later, I got a letter from Mauritius saying that since I'm arriving at retirement age, I was entitled to 9,000 rupees a month. But coming back to your question, I have to say that I have great respect for the United Kingdom because I have often acted as counsel against them, and I've never had any problems with UK authorities. They really respect the independence of barristers. I have many friends in the Foreign Office who are legal counsel, and I've never had any problems. However, my other country, France, doesn't like it at all. A Frenchman never goes to the court in The Hague to plead against France. I did that in 1995, and I'm not the only one who did it, and the Quai d'Orsay has never forgotten it and tries to punish me even today, 25 years later. And that is why in the book I include a short passage which you may have noticed where I tell the story of a French judge during the trial for the advisory opinion. I'm a lawyer, I'm a barrister, and we have this principle of independence. The advisory opinion on nuclear arms in 1995, I was counsel for Samoa and the Solomon Islands. And that was when President Chirac announced that France was going to resume its nuclear tests in the South Pacific. And the Attorney General of Samoa began his speech to the court by saying, we are outraged in our country by the decision of France. And I saw, and others saw, the French judge, who speaks English, understands everything, very ostentatiously take off his headset. He'd been listening to the interpretation. He put it on the table, and he crossed his arms, and he pretended to no longer be listening. In my Anglo-Saxon tradition, this is something one just does not do. A professor of international law should not write this in his book either, because it's a secret, you shouldn't say things like this. But I thought, I don't care. I'm also writing this book for my students and other students to help them understand how international law really works. Not just from the textbooks, the law school textbooks. I want them to see how things really work. And this has become a central theme in my books, the Ratline, The Last Colony, the key role of people, individuals in all legal decisions. States didn't coin the concept of genocide or crimes against humanity. It was individual people. It wasn't states who fought for the Chagosians. It was the Chagosians themselves. The judges decide as individuals, and it's people in their roles that make these decisions. That is key in all my writings. You name British authorities who exacerbate the conditions of the Chagosian, and you often state their names. Not always, not always. I'm very careful in certain matters. For example, the British ambassador, who said we want self-determination for the Falklands but not for the Chagosians. It was dreadful. Everybody understood what she was getting at in the room. But she's a good person. She had instructions from London that she had to carry out. She was saying what she'd been told to say. She wasn't speaking with her own voice. It wasn't her speaking. It was the ambassador of the United Kingdom. And so I didn't put her name in the book. Do you see what I mean? It's the way you play your role that's important. But every judge, yes, because they have a choice. I didn't put the name of the French judge. I could have done that. I decided not to. Well, we saw that France abstained in the vote at the General Assembly, and the French judge voted in favor of Mauritius. France has problems with Mayotte, the Comores, and other islands, so for me this was really an expression of independence by the French judge. As an individual, he was expressing himself as an individual judge and not a French judge. There's a sentence that you quote several times, Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister in 1964. You said, "We need to frighten them with hope." Is that one of the most terrible sentences in your book? Use it several times. Frighten them with hope, we say. It's absolutely dreadful. The British really have a way with words. It's a very powerful and very horrible expression, frighten them with hope, especially in English. But there are other phrases that are used in the book. In the 2009 document that was leaked by WikiLeaks, the language is absolutely frightening. A British diplomat talking in 2009 about Tarzans and Man Fridays. What does that mean? When you think about it, it's absolutely dreadful to still be using that kind of language. And what strikes me, you reacted to this phrase, frighten them with hope. In Mauritius, people were furious when they saw the sentence about the Tarzans and the Man Fridays. It was so offensive. We come back to the effect of words. Here we are at Bibliotopia. It's about writing. It's about words, books, ideas that are written down. And I think that we understand, as with the term genocide and crimes against humanity, that the written word, ideas that are turned into written words, can have a huge effect. I felt this, I mentioned it this morning during the session with Olesya Kromechuk when we were talking about Ukraine. In 2022, 4 years after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I wrote an article in the Financial Times about the idea of setting up a special tribunal for crimes of aggression. There you go, a few words, one article, and the idea takes root, and now we're going to have a special tribunal. So in Bibliotopia and elsewhere, I would say that words really matter. They can really change things. You write with time, the feelings of injustice tend to ferment, and channels must be found to direct the energies that are produced. Is this what gives you hope and energy in your work? Yes, I'm very proud to be an international lawyer, but, and I don't know how you would say this in French,
I am not starry-eyed about international law.
I'm not starry-eyed about international law. How would we interpret this? Starry-eyed. I have no stars in my eyes. You're not an idealist? I'm slightly idealistic. I'm a bit of an idealist, but I can see reality. I'm a realist. I'm a realistic idealist. And I know that it's going to take time. In my field of international law, there was a turning point in 1945. We talked about it on stage with the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations, the idea that every human being has a minimum set of fundamental rights. That's revolutionary. It was the first time in the existence of humankind that emperors, monarchs, presidents, prime ministers were subjected to a higher standard of law, and we're seeing the consequences of this now. Mr. Trump is fighting this with Make America Great, Mr. Johnson with his Brexit, Putin, China. We see what's happening now because of this idea. And we need to defend this idea, I believe. But it's a very long-term project. It's going to take not just decades, but centuries, and it's just the beginning. So yes, I'm working for it. I'll be a militant if I need to. But I also recognize the reality of the situation and our situation. But we just have to persevere. And sometimes we see remarkable things happening. In February 2019, when the Court of Justice in The Hague found for the Chagosians, it was one of the greatest moments of my life, aside from the moment when the House of Lords found against Pinochet for torture and crimes and genocide in 1998. So there are key moments like that that can keep you afloat in your optimism. You say that this decision was also the end of the Great Britain, Britain as a superpower. So this is, you're talking about Great Britain, but it could be France or another country. Do you think it's a good thing? Yes, France is really worried because both of these countries are permanent members of the Security Council. I find that a bit crazy that in 2023 they should both be permanent members. But after Brexit, the UK is going downhill, which makes me very sad because I think the United Kingdom could continue to play an important role, but currently the situation is catastrophic. And as I describe in the book, at this key moment in 2017 with the vote between Mauritius with a population of 1 million and the UK and the United States, it was David and Goliath. We weren't really expecting such a striking result. And Brexit really changed everything. The other countries of the EU said, you're no longer our problem, go off on your own, we're not going to lobby for you, you're on your own. So this was catastrophic for the British. And in the book, I describe my time in New York in the Indonesian room when I was lobbying for the resolution to send the 2 questions to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. I felt pulled in 2 different directions. The UK is the country where I live, for which I have great affection. But a Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time happened to be called Boris Johnson. What a horrid character. He's a misogynist, he's a racist, he's a narcissist. Really a nasty piece of work. I've known him for 35 years. He was married to a good friend of mine. I know him very, very well. So there I am at the UN. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he talks, people listen. He was a journalist. He wrote for the Daily Telegraph, a right-wing newspaper, before he became a politician, before he became Minister of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister. And in one of his articles, He described Africans as
pickaninnies with watermelon smiles.
Pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. It's absolutely revolting. So for readers of the Daily Telegraph, it might seem funny, amusing, but not in New York. And when the Minister of Foreign Affairs has written articles, everybody reads these articles throughout the world. So Boris Johnson actually helped us a lot when it came to voting. Whenever anyone mentioned Boris Johnson, people would say, no, no, don't talk about Boris, we'll vote with you. But it's a bit sad. How did we end up here? How did we end up in a situation where the UK could have a Minister of Foreign Affairs and then a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson? Things have changed. I think the pendulum is swinging back. He's not great, but he's a grown-up and he's repairing relationships with the European Union. There is a change of direction, but over the last 5 years, the situation has been dire. Are there any questions from the audience? We can't see them if there are, says Philippe. We don't know if you have questions. The lady in the front row here. I wanted to ask you whether there probably are other states in the same situation as the Chagosians. Is this case law, will this case law be useful for them? Will the judgment be useful for them? I understand. Yeah, it's an important question. Before the 19th of February, we were telling people, no, this creates no precedent. Why did we say this? Because we knew that for the judges at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, it was important to argue this case narrowly, to say it was a unique case, it was a specific case, and there weren't any other cases like it. And in a way, it's true. There aren't any similar histories except perhaps Mayotte and the Comores, where part of the territory was carved out before the country gained independence. But if you're talking about a country seeking self-determination, we knew very well that if the court took the direction that it did, that other matters would arise. And of course, on the 30th of December last year, the first of several copycat cases, resolutions, were tabled on Palestine and the self-determination, the right to self-determination of the Palestinian population, especially but not exclusively in the occupied territories. And other countries are seeing how this is working. The ambassador of Mauritius gets visits from people who ask him, can you explain how you went about it? And so we can do the same thing. And there are several cases that are coming up. We'll see. But what's the important thing about this advisory opinion by the ICJ is that it was clear. It wasn't, there was no ambiguity. It's binding on the United Nations, but not on the states. And that, but it still has, it has an important effect. For example, with an advisory opinion and the General Assembly resolution accepting the advisory opinion, all the specialized agencies of the United Nations now have to apply the decision. So we've got a strategy which is to go to all the specialized agencies of the United Nations. We started with the Food and Agriculture Organization because of fishing in the Indian Ocean. And the second we chose for very specific reasons, and it is the Universal Postal Union. the ones that regulate postal services. Why did we do it? Because we know that the British are very keen on their stamps. So we went to the Universal Postal Union and we requested a resolution stating that the stamps for the British Indian Ocean Territory not be accepted in the world, in the entire world, and we got it. That was the first resolution, and it had a devastating effect on the British. I'm not a stamp collector, but there's a shop in London that's very well known. If you're a stamp collector, it's called Stanley Gibbons. And recently, a month ago, I was walking down the Strand with the ambassador of Mauritius, and we went past Stanley Gibbons. We decided to go in. And quite wickedly, we said, "Do you have any new stamps from the British Indian Ocean Territory?" And the guy was 80 years old, and he said, no, that's all over. There's been a resolution by the Universal Postal Union. There'll be no more stamps from the BIOT. So little by little, that's how we do it. But the most important thing is that this decision was binding on the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, and the maritime borders between Maldives and Mauritius are going to be defined soon, and it's all over for the British. So that was a major effect of the advisory opinion. Another question? I think there's somebody over here who'd like to ask a question. Yes, it's a question about history. It's a historical question. Once I was in an air show in Toulouse, and there were military planes flying over, mainly American planes. And there were students, aeronautic students from Toulouse, who said, "Oh, it's outrageous what the U.S. did in Vietnam." I was standing behind them, and I had to remind them that the French had participated in the war before the Americans took over in Vietnam. When you're in a country that has a certain system, it's easy to criticize others. What would we do if we were caught in a country that was occupied by the Nazis or the Russians, who are forced to fall in line behind Putin unless they want to go to prison? And maybe that's coming to Switzerland soon, I don't know. Well, in several countries, we're arriving at the crunch moment. Look what's happening in Russia right now. Expressing an opinion that is in any way against the current state of affairs or the current policy will take you straight to prison. And I know people who are in prison today simply because they said one wrong word. I've thought about this a great deal, especially when I was writing East-West Street. It's very tricky to know what I would have done in 1939. What would I have done if I had been living in France in 1939? My grandfather arrived in France in 1939 from Vienna. He was Jewish. The Nazis rolled into Paris in June 1940, occupied the northern half of France. They created a Jewish organization, and that Jewish organization was working with the Germans, and they were giving the names and addresses of Jews to the Germans. Would I have done the same? I don't know. I can't criticize them because I don't know what I would have done.
It's a matter of individual conscience.
It's a matter of individual conscience. In every moment. I'm fortunate not to have lived through that. The closest thing that I've seen in my lifetime was 2003 in the war in Iraq. We were asked to support the government. it wasn't difficult for me to oppose it. There were millions of us who were against the war. When there are millions, it's easier to speak out. But what would I do if I were living in Russia today? Would I stay? Would I leave? I can't tell you. I cannot say. I hope that I would do the right thing. But you can never be sure how you'll react until you're confronted with something like that and you have to make a decision. So, in my books, I try not to criticize people, but to emphasize the decisions taken. That's what I did this evening. In the documentation that the Chagosians obtained were the legal advice of the British lawyers in 1965, and there were two schools of thought. One said, we can't do this. And the other group said, yes, we can do it. We can do whatever we want. Those who said, we can do whatever we want, or the legal counsel who said that, in fact, I know him. He died 2 years ago. He's an international lawyer. He wrote 2 books, and I put his name in the book, Tony Aust, A-U-S-T. Why did I put his name in the book? The reader can form his or her own opinion of what he did and what Henry Darwin, the opposing counsel, did. I hope I would have acted like Mr. Darwin and not Mr. Aust, but can I say that with total certainty? No, I can't. I hope I would have done the right thing, but we don't know how we'll react before the moment comes. Do we have time for one last question, Madam? Thank you. We talked about Ukraine, and I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you, given your expertise in international law, will Putin ever be brought to justice and prosecuted on the basis of international law? Is there any chance to see him brought to justice? Is there a chance that Mr. Putin might be brought to justice someday? Once again, we don't know. When someone asks me that question, I think back to the 13th of June, 1942, St. James's Palace in London, where a dozen leaders in exile came together to adopt what has been called since the Declaration of St. James. They stated that after the war, there must be a procedure to prosecute and judge the Nazi officers. Charles de Gaulle and the other leaders were involved in this, and everyone said, yes, it's a very good idea, but will it ever happen? But everything leads to something else, and we never know what's going to happen. The same goes for Milosevic. In 1995, no one ever thought that Milosevic would one day be in a jail cell in The Hague and have to appear before the court. So it seems unlikely, but not impossible for Putin. But that distance between improbable and impossible, that reality lies, and we can't know ahead of time. What I can say is that we have to remain true to our principles while we're waiting, and we have to proceed. If we're attached to the idea of the rule of law, we have to proceed accordingly, and we have to recognize that Mr. Putin's war is obviously illegal. In my opinion, it's a crime of aggression, and I don't think it's acceptable to have a situation where the International Criminal Court is only prosecuting the lower-ranking officers or soldiers, and the high-ranking officers and government officials are getting off scot-free. They have to be held responsible. It's about 12 people in Moscow who are responsible for this entire aggression. But we have to go further. We have to also recognize and acknowledge that hypocrisy and the double standard is present. And for me, the war in Iraq was very obviously illegal, contrary to international law. The Foreign Office Deputy Legal Advisor resigned in March 2003 because he refused to be involved in an aggression which he felt was tantamount to a crime of aggression. If the action against Putin leads to action against Tony Blair and George Bush, well, then that's the way it is. We have to apply the standard of international law equally. We can't choose the ones we don't like. Oh, we don't like Putin, but let's let them get away with it. They're our guys. So this is why France, the UK, and the United States are very worried right now. They've said, yes, well, we can live with the idea of a new tribunal, but it depends on what kind of tribunal you want, because everybody understands very clearly that if we establish a special tribunal for crimes of aggression, for the Russian aggression, we can also do the same thing tomorrow for the US, the UK, and France. We can absolutely do it. There will be a precedent. And we have to be honest and acknowledge that and forge ahead. That's my opinion. Well, that's a wonderful promise. Let's have some music. Yes, let's round off the evening with a little musical interlude. Is Guillaume here? Could you come back and play us something that will let us finish the evening in a calm state of mind, have a nice weekend, nothing too serious or too depressing? He's a wonderful classical and jazz pianist. I have no idea what he's going to play for us. It will be an improvisation and a reaction to what he's heard over the last 30 minutes. So we are all ears, Guillaume de Chassis.